Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Hinterland, America's New Landscape of Class and Conflict by Phil A. Neel. And we are beginning the first chapter, which is entitled Oaths of Blood. I would like to encourage people to please share this podcast episode on whatever social media platform it is that you frequent. Remember, we put these episodes out on SoundCloud, Facebook, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pocket Cast, Anchor, anywhere audio is available. We have this podcast available as well. So we read through the introduction of Hinterland, and it described to us some of the things that we can expect to read in the following pages of the book. It laid out some of the class and capitalistic issues that it's going to address, some of the perspectives of the social commentary it's going to give. It also did a very good job of emphasizing the importance of understanding how the local class conflicts are connected to national and then global class conflicts, which is something I think is a very important thing to keep in mind when learning about an issue, is learning about the way that issue may morph when it goes from being local to national, and then from national to global, and vice versa. We've seen some of the similarities between deindustrialization effects in the Rust Belt in America and Midwestern cities in America, and the effects that they've had in China. And we also learned the author's definition of hinterland and the two specific kind of hinterlands he's going to be addressing throughout this book. And hinterlands being defined largely by geography and a factor of distance from the booming cores of the supposedly post-industrial economy. Far hinterland is more traditionally rural, and then he speaks about near winterlands as well. Far and near hinterlands are the most specific ones. Near hinterlands, by contrast, encompasses the foothills descending from the summit of the megacity. It is largely suburban in character. So near hinterlands are suburban. He spoke about Ferguson as an example. Far hinterlands are the rural spaces. Okay, let's dive in. Chapter 1, Oaths of Blood. In northern Nevada, the soil alternates between a dull yellow and a jaundiced gray, intercut with the washed-out color of skin-rending sagebrush, a sweet-smelling corpse of a plant that clusters in vast, broken archipelagos scattered across endless seas of hyper-flammable cheatgrass. When the sun is at its highest, creatures rest in the intricate rootwork of the brush, bodies entwined in the shade, where undead tendrils offer respite to predator and prey alike. Small dens dug by families of wild foxes, crevices filled with shivering shrews, weasels, and mice. Lightless sinkholes hiding legions of night-black beetles, roots entwined with rattlesnakes biding their time. Everything stinks of sun-heated sage, and after working a day on the range, you return to the trailer with the same smell, covered in thin layers of yellow-gray dust. That scent burns its way into your memory like a callus. I was stationed in Winnemucca, a small mining and gambling town just east of the Black Rock Desert and south of the borders with Oregon and Idaho. The town is at the heart of a large swath of arid countryside, roughly equidistant between Bunkerville, Nevada, and Burns, Oregon, the two sites of the recent Bundy family standoffs that helped to spark the nation's resurgence of an armed and organized far right. Its economy resembles Its economy resembles those of other rural counties in the far west, dominated by the boom and bust of global commodity markets, softened somewhat by seasonal work and tourism, wildland firefighting, and the management of federal land. I was there in 2011, still a boom year, with Chinese stimulus money driving up the price of natural resources and the economic crisis pushing gold prices to historic highs, all accompanied by the flow of new federal subsidies for natural natural gas pipelines, and stimulus-funded employment programs. It was also the first new boom for the growth of the far right. Having dwindled from their last peak in the 1990s, the election of Obama has stoked a nationwide resurgence of militias and affiliated groups, accompanied by massive purchases of arms and ammunition. Though nominally led by members of the old, more explicitly white supremacist militia movement, with its roots in posse comitatus, Christian identity sects, and traditional neo-Nazi gangs, the new movement includes a number of young recruits who have no such history and who often hold no explicit white supremacist views. Many of these new recruits have been drawn from the generation of disaffected veterans who fought in the wars of the Bush era, only to return to hometowns crippled by economic depression and budget cuts. The movement has also been marked by a shift away from the militia as its sole basis for organizing, with numerous non-militia or quasi-militia groups forming alongside more traditional paramilitaries. As part of the shift away from the militia, this right-wing resurgence has seen the emergence of new ethno-nationalist groups that have rejected traditional white nationalism in favor of a national anarchist or third positionist politics. Instead of forming militias, such groups advocate the creation of cult-like, quote, tribes, end quote, capable of building, quote, autonomous zones, end quote, and returning to the land. These groups often use the language, tactics, and aesthetics of the radical left, and frequently exist within the same subcultures. Among the most prominent of these are clearinghouse organizations, such as the Attack the Systems, as well as more organized groupings such as the Wolves of Vinland, a neo-pagan nationalist cult organized like a biker gang and based around a land project they call, quote, Offheim, end quote, near Leichenburg, Virginia, where the Wolves crowdfunded the construction of a traditional Viking longhouse. The Wolves have 3 major chapters, with apparent organizational centers in Virginia, the Mountain States, and the Pacific Northwest, as well as a larger propaganda wing called, quote, Operation Werewolf, end quote, which yokes together the participation of smaller groups nationwide. Much of their material is distinguished by a well-designed aesthetic, with clean logos plastered on professional-looking photos of muscle-strapped white men standing near fires, their faces painted with runes and shoulders covered by animal pelts, all accompanied by terse taglines well-suited to distribution over social media. Their work is popularized by semi-mainstream theorists like Jack Donovan, founder of the Wolves' quote, Cascadia, end quote, chapter, and author of a series of books on tribalism and masculinity. Donovan and the Wolves propose an across-the-board return to one's own, quote, indigenous, end quote, roots, which will allow for the formation of a new confederacy of non-state, self-governing, communitarian, quote, tribes, end quote, defined in cultural terms, but essentially reducible to ethnicities. They thereby discover a politics commensurate and compatible with the various ethno-nationalisms offered by the, quote, decolonial, end quote, fraction of the miserable American left, and often understand themselves as part of this broader current. Such groups simply see themselves as building a place for white people within a communitarian confederacy of newly indigenous traditionalism, and their language often mirrors that of the left in arguing for a return to indigenous roots and the construction of autonomous zones. Donovan, for example, often mixes left-wing and right-wing rhetoric in a single breath, arguing that the Wolves' Back to the Land project in Virginia is, quote, about escaping to another world, not just for an hour or even a day, but for good. The Wolves of Vinland are becoming barbarians. They're leaving behind attachments to the state, to enforced egalitarianism, to desperate commercialism, to this grotesque modern world of synthetic beauty and dead gods. They're building an autonomous zone, a community defined by face-to-face and fist-to-face connections where manliness and honor matter again, end quote. Sounds toxic. Similarly, Paul Wagner, one of the group's founders, clearly lays out the tribal basis of this organization. Quote, when I say tribe, family, whatever, that's a very well understood idea that these people are inside and those people are outside, end quote. The tribe, then, is understood as a closed, communitarian space opposed to both the state as such and any left-wing universalism. The Wolves, though offering a pristine example of the far right's ability to craft an attractive aesthetic and mobilize in quasi-left political projects, remain a somewhat specialized fringe group within the larger right-wing resurgence. Similarly, the quote, alt-right, end quote, which rose to prominence with the election of Trump, has a media presence that far outweighs its significance, doubtless due to the fact that its particular brand of frat boy fascism finds its base on college campuses populated by equally out-of-touch leftists, creating a virtuous circle of confrontations that spread widely on social media but largely draw from two very narrow demographics. Once his figureheads were defeated, Milo Yiannopoulos via public outcry and Richard Spencer via repeated punches to the face, the phenomenon faded with the spectacle. By 2017, Spencer's, quote, Unite the Right, end quote, rally in Charlottesville was widely recognized as an explicitly white nationalist event. Its violent conclusion, with white supremacist James Fields plowing his car into counter-protesters, resulting in numerous injuries and the death of Heather Heyer, served only to further crumble the carefully cultivated image of the, quote, alt-right, end quote, widening the divide between, quote, patriot, end quote, groups and the more explicitly racist factions of the movement. Since the media backlash, and despite Trump's soft praise for the far-right protesters, even explicitly white supremacist organizations such as Vanguard America have rebranded themselves using the language and imagery of the patriot movement, rather than the, quote, alt-right, end quote, and patriot symbols have begun to dominate the cultural field of conservatism in general. Though the, quote, alt-right, end quote, phenomenon was significant insofar as it offered a space for a new far-right culture to gestate, it is only via the rise of new, quote, patriot, end quote, groups that this culture seems able to take flesh. At the same time, a certain degree of institutionalization came with the elevation of Steve Bannon into a central advisory position within the Trump administration. Though he has since exited the position, he has done so in the hopes of exerting even more influence via his ownership and management of various propaganda outlets. This represents an administrative mainstreaming of the far right, but doesn't signal much about its rank and file base. Okay. That was a lot. Let's reflect. So I believe in the book Have Black Lives Matter that the event that took place in Charleston, South Carolina was covered. So that's one of our first connections to previous books, or explicit connections to a previous book. One of the things I often like to do when I'm reading is to draw connections from one piece of literature to another piece of literature to sort of, and I don't know if this is the right way to use intersectionality, and it's not the right way to use intersectionality, but just to sort of, and it helps with intersectionality because usually these different books are talking about different groups of people who are vulnerable to different types of oppression or subjugation or marginalization. So it does, in a way, facilitate understanding intersectionality, but also it is, for me, it's a way of educating instead of becoming trained. Sometimes you can read one book and you can assess the verbiage in that book only to the concepts in that book. And I try a lot of times to be able to, read one thing and let the context in there dictate something, and read something else and let a new context dictate something else. And so in this book, or so in this passage, when they talk about the rally in Charlottesville, it is from the vantage point of dissecting the alt-right movement that was facilitating it, as opposed from the vantage point of the counter protesters who were combating it. And looking at both sides is important, because you can't only dissect the things that people who you consider your allies to be engaging in. You must also dissect the things that people you believe to be adversarial to your goals are engaging in as well. And so this is the most I've ever read in any of the books about alt-right theories, or what was one of the other, white indigenous theories, which, I think that's one of the things about the word indigenous, is that there can only be one group of people or one set of people who are indigenous to a land, and there's no, and I don't say no, but there's of course some white people here who have uh, indigenous DNA, indigenous blood in them, but however, to be a group of white people and to be using this concept of going back to the land or being indigenous is ironic because there is a continent that is indigenous for white people, or that people who consider themselves to be white consider themselves to be connected to European ancestry. There is a continent that they have that exists that they could go back to and try these same things there. And so I just find it interesting to have to understand a portion of some of these things. They talked about how they were trying to escape, leaving behind attachments to the state, desperate commercialism, and the modern world of synthetic beauty and dead gods. I think that there's a very uh, true statements within there, and a lot of times that's how it is when tribalism exists. Is that different tribes will be able to touch on different aspects of the truth, but because you are engaged in tribalism and not communalism or humanitarianism, something that a collectivism, something that sees all of us as a whole, you often don't have the entire truth. You have a portion of the truth. And so we see here that these people have a portion of a truth, and they're using that portion of the truth to build these movements. And that's what leads these people into to being deceived by rhetoric that leaders and that their leaders and stuff like that put out. And I think one of the other things in here too is they talked about the similarities in some of the verbiage used by these groups as to some of the verbiage used by left wing groups and or liberal groups. And I think that is that is very true. Both of these sets of groups, when people are talking about them, they're talking for the most part about the white people who within these groups have the most power and have the loudest voice. These groups rarely, whether it's far right, far left, liberal, conservative, they rarely encapsulate the experiences of the masses of black people and people of color in this country. Uh, and so those are all some of the things that I sort of was thinking about as we were reading through this. Here, let's and then the patriot concept. I think that's a lot of times racism and white supremacy and white nationalism is often hid behind the concept of patriotism or things that are symbolisms symbolize patriotism or remind people of patriotism. Far more representative of the resurgence than are the original patriot organizations such as the Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters, which have widespread bases of support in the tens of thousands measured by social media followings, and at least a few thousand actual members. Both understand themselves as part of a vibrant, quote, patriot movement, end quote, that is preparing for the coming of a second American Revolution marked by civil war and social collapse, all inflected by a political philosophy in line with that promoted by Bannon within and now beyond the Trump administration. Both include armed groups and regularly host paramilitary trainings, but neither group is simply a militia. Instead, they act as a semi-decentralized umbrella organization that include and exceed the activity of their constituent member groups, some of which are more or less traditionally organized militias and some of which are not. They often overlap, sometimes uneasily, with one another and with other far-right groups, but they have generally cut any lingering ties to explicitly white supremacist organizations and even tend to distance themselves from the more terroristic wings of anti-immigrant and Islamophobic movements in the U.S., even while opposing the resettlement of Syrian refugees and using border patrols in Arizona for informal military training. The fuck? The Oath Keepers portray themselves as an association of current and former military, police, and first responders opposing the totalitarian term within the U.S. government. Their name comes from the notion that their members are simply staying true to the oaths they took to protect the American people. Under present conditions, they argue, the protection of the people means opposition to the government and a refusal to carry out, quote, unconstitutional, end quote, orders. Though it is still unclear how this anti-government politics will render itself under a Trump presidency, on a grander scale, they see resistance forming first in the far hinterland, where local residents can be organized into self-reliant militias, and local governments can be won over to their cause to create a rural base of power, parallel and opposed to that of the federal government. These are the core unifying features of the group, though its individual wings often wrap these ideas up in a wide array of conspiracy theories, anti-immigrant rhetoric, and veiled racism, the prevalence and precise character of which depends on the chapter in question. The Three Percenters are a somewhat broader organization, often overlapping with the Oath Keepers, and in recent years, both have undergone a general, loose fusion. Their name is taken from the claim that only 3% of the U.S. population directly participated in the original American Revolution, and that, therefore, only a minority of individuals will be required to overthrow government tyranny in a second revolution to come. Emblazoned with the Roman numeral for 3 and a circle of 13 stars representing the original American colonies, the group's symbolism speaks to the commitment of its members to be this 3% when the time comes. Ideologically, both the Three Percenters and the Oath Keepers draw strongly, though somewhat haphazardly, from American libertarianism, and both advocate attempts at local preparation and self-reliance. The Three Percenters, in contrast to the Oath Keepers, are a much more consistently and vocally anti-immigrant group, with much of their non-militia organizing efforts going into openly anti-immigrant or Islamophobic organizing, such as a series of marches aimed at preventing the resettlement of Syrian refugees in Idaho. In those early years in Winnemucca, these groups had only just begun to congeal. After our 10-hour shifts in the desert, my coworker and I would relax with drinks and free games of pool at a local bar called the Mine Shaft, a catchment for dead-eyed miners coming off a 12-hour shift, burners biding their time until this year's brief slice of drug-addled reprieve, vaguely white supremacist bikers looking for blood, broken-bodied cowboys, and old Basque men trying to wait out the sun. Smoke drifted between muffled shouts and pictures of topless women on motorcycles. On the weekends, there were knife fights, fist fights, arguments, rounds of drinks, blood spilled in the dust outside. Sometimes train hoppers would wander in from the rail yard, mostly crust-punk traveler kids with their dogs and denim jackets, soon chased off by the local sheriff who, rumor had it, used to rule the county with impunity, tying vagrants up and throwing them into the river. If I'd paid attention, I would have maybe seen in all of this the slow encroachment of the new symbols over the old standards of bike gangs and run-of-the-mill desert libertarianism. But at the time, these things were just under the surface, swells forming before the wave took shape. And then that brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter, so let's take a moment to reflect. So one of the things that I have become very adept at doing, if I must say so myself, is noticing the contradictions and noticing the hypocrisies, highlighting the hypocrisies is what I like to say. I think that man, his name, Fred Hampton. I think Fred Hampton used to say that it's we want to heighten the contradictions, I think is what he would point out. And so the hypocrisy of being having anti-immigrant beliefs or ideologies and having the 13 colonies as a symbol, or having the number 13 as a symbol to signify the 13 colonies is ludicrous to me. And it sort of just puts you in a position where, like, anybody who's a white supremacist or a white nationalist or has any type of beliefs of the white race being superior or whatever, is somebody who doesn't understand history, somebody who doesn't understand science, somebody who doesn't understand literature. You know, you can't be well-informed and have these type of thoughts and beliefs. And usually when people don't have well-informed belief systems or ideologies, they have all types of these contradictions and these hypocrisies within their structure, within their policies, procedures, symbolism, or whatever, and it exists within America at a heightened level. Anybody, you can almost go to any, whether it's Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, uh, rich, poor, middle class, you can go to almost anybody. And if they buy into the belief of America and the American dream, and then you begin to converse with them about their experiences and the things that they don't like about the country, or things they think should be different in the country, what you'll see is eventually they begin to contradict themselves. They'll talk about the things they love in America in one breath, and then the things they don't like in America in the other breath. And both of the things are intertwined with each other. One can't happen without the other. Uh, and so we see the same thing here. They have an issue with immigration, as they're in a country that was built on immigration, built on immigrants, that uh, was a country that was taken from people who were indigenous to this land. Uh, and so again, I think that, to me, that just stands out immediately as a contradiction. But also, I think the importance of understanding that these racist groups, these white nationalists, white supremacists, or patriotic alt-right groups, that when you look at the things that they are in alignment of being opposed to, it lets you know that those are sets of people that should be aligned together, because there are people who are uniting themselves against them. And I don't know if I'm saying that the right way, or if that's coming off the right way, but if me and you, sometimes having a common enemy, even if you aren't an ally, should lead you down the path of organizing with the person who shares the common enemy with you, or learning more about why you and this person have this common enemy, so that way you can work together, so that way you can be cohesive uh, to struggle against some of the common adversaries that you may have. Man, trying to see if we got time to read another. Here, let's try to read a little bit more, and then we'll end this episode. Wastelands. In the midst of a far-right movement dominated by internet threats, spectacular street brawls, and run-of-the-mill white male terrorism, the patriot groups stand out owing to their focus on self-reliant initiatives. Faced with devastating declines in government services, many have stepped in to provide basic social services and natural disaster training. This is particularly notable in rural counties in states like Oregon, where the combination of long-term collapse in timber revenue and dwindling federal subsidies has all but emptied the coffers of local governments. In Josephine County, located in the Rogue River region of southwestern Oregon, the sheriff's department is able to employ only a minuscule number of deputies, depending almost entirely on federal money, and often cannot offer emergency services after hours. In 2013, the county jail was downsized and inmates were simply released en masse. In the rural areas outside Grants Pass, the county's largest city, with its own locally funded police department, the crime rate has skyrocketed, and the sheriff encouraged people at risk of things like domestic abuse simply to, quote, consider relocating to an area with adequate law enforcement services, end quote. In this situation, the Oath Keepers began to offer basic, quote, community preparedness, end quote, and, quote, disaster response, end quote, courses, and encouraged the formation of community watches and fully blown militias as parallel government structures. They offer preparation workshops for the earthquake predicted to hit the Pacific Northwest and, quote, also volunteer for community service, painting houses, building a handicap playground, and constructing wheelchair ramps for elderly or infirm residents, end quote. While often winning the hearts and minds of local residents, these new power structures are by no means services necessarily structured to benefit those most at risk. The Patriot movement surge in the county followed a widely publicized campaign to, quote, defend, end quote, a local mining claim against the Bureau of Land Management, after the mine proprietors were found to be out of compliance with Bureau of Land Management standards. This sort of vigilante protection of small businesses, local extractive industries, and property holders, in particular ranchers, is often at the heart of patriot activity, and it is their skill at local organizing that makes the Patriots far more threatening than their more spectacular counterparts. The Oath Keepers also piloted the Patriots movement, quote, inside, outside, end quote, strategy, within which local self-reliance. Let me try that one more time. The Oath Keepers also piloted the Patriot movement's, quote, inside, outside, end quote, strategy, within which local self-reliance initiatives were only one, slightly more direct tactic among many. This strategy puts an equally strong emphasis on, quote, inside, end quote, work via formal administrative channels facilitated by entry into local government and the Republican Party in a way that synthesizes well with the, quote, outside, end quote, work they do in defunded timber country or along the U.S.-Mexican border, where they prepare and establish parallel structures of power. While filling in the holes left by underfunded law enforcement in Josephine County, for example, Patriot-affiliated politicians were also leading the opposition to new property tax measures that would help allow the hiring of more deputies. This, of course, helps to widen the funding shortfall further, helping extra state militias to step in and begin their own power within the county. The Patriot parties thereby seek to extend and secure the economic conditions for their own expansion. The thing that makes the Patriots unique, then, is their recognition of the need to build power within these wastelands and their surprising ability to outcompete the dwindling state and local progressives in this endeavor. These groups are essentially engaged in a battle for, quote, competitive control, end quote, a term used by the Australian military strategist David Kilcullen, a senior advisor to General Petraeus in 2007 and 2008, and a special advisor on counterinsurgency to Condoleezza Rice, in describing the rise of guerrilla forces within the interstices of falling states. Interstice, I had to look that up. Interstice, definition is an intervening space, especially a very small one. Okay. Kilcullen argues that the success of insurgencies such as the Taliban in Afghanistan, as well as the rise of expansive criminal syndicates in places like Jamaica, can both be explained by the ways in which such groups succeeded in providing, quote, a predictable, consistent, and wide-spectrum normative system of control, end quote, that helps to win over a population buffeted by the chaotic inconsistency of economic and cultural collapse. By providing material incentives that guarantee stability combined with threats of coercion for those who oppose them, such groups become capable of making the population complicit in their rise, regardless of ideological positions. In fact, Kilcullen points out that in such situations, epitomized by all-out civil war, support for one faction or another simply does not follow ideology. People don't throw their weight behind those they agree with, and often many in a population can't be said to have any deep-seated ideological commitment in the first place. Political or religious attachment is often an after-the-fact development, preceded by the capable intervention of a pragmatic, functional partisan group that begins as a small minority of the population. The notion of the, quote, 3%, end quote, is essentially the recognition of this fact, and the entire model of patriot organizing follows the insurgent logic detailed by Kilcullen. And then that brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter, and we will end the episode here. We'll have a reflection, then we'll end the episode, but this will be the last passage that we read. And what stands out to me is the author did a very good job in these last passages of sort of identifying some of the organizing methods used by these groups, identifying some of the tactics used by these groups, and there are things to be learned from it. There are very credible and substantial things that they are doing. The ideology behind them is the issue, and he did a great job of explaining at the end here that a lot of times people follow these type of groups not because they agree with the ideology, but because they are fulfilling a need where there's a lack at, and it is after the fact that they piggyback on the ideology. And I mean, that's true for this country. Most people who live in this country don't have the exact same ideology of this country because they don't even have enough money to have this or power to have the same ideology of this country. But because they feel that this country is providing a need or fulfilling a need for them, they they are they buy in eventually to the ideology of the country, sometimes to their own detriment or to the detriment of the community that they're from. But there are things to be learned from the manner in which they're organizing. The inside outside strategy is one that I believe is very important. Dr. King talked about that, the concept of that strategy. I consider myself to be an outside person, but that doesn't mean, but being an outside person to me means making sure that I learn enough and I'm educated enough that through time I can, from the outside, change what the culture on the outside or change beliefs on the outside or change the climate on the outside. And that can lead to a residual effect on the inside. And hopefully some people who may one day end up being on the inside, I can have an influence or some type of a sway on their beliefs and on their ideology. But the inside outside strategy is one that is very important to have. And it's one that you have to be cognizant of. And it's one that works, that's easier to do when you are a group that is based on issues that white people feel are more directly impacting them. Because we live in a country that has been determined and ran by white supremacy and white nationalism, and a white person trying to get on the inside of the system will always have an easier go at it than a black person or a person of color trying to get on the inside of a system. Was there anything else in here? This was very interesting. Learn about the Oath Keepers, learn about the 3%ers, learn about the Patriot movement, alt-right movement. I thought this sentence about the Oath Keepers was interesting. They portray themselves as an association that is people who are oppositional to the government and refuse to carry out unconstitutional orders, is what the Oath Keeper said. And I find that very interesting. I wonder what their definition of unconstitutional is. That was another thought that I had as I was reading. That was a few pages back. But we will be back tomorrow to continue reading Hinterland, to learn more about some of these groups that exist in some of these areas in the country. And remember, we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide people the opportunity to begin or further their journey in the struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And I will holler at you tomorrow.